Now, to give a local perspective and speak on how mental health issues affect the Black community in particular, please welcome Keishia Facey. Keishia has worked as an equity and community engagement consultant on several projects to address anti-oppression and anti-Black racism. Notably, she worked as a researcher, writer, and facilitator on the provincially mandated Ministry of Children and Youth Services adaptation of the SNAP program for Black and African Canadian children, and the development of Legal Aid, Ontario's Black Legal Action Centre. Keishia's career began with the CMHA Association, I'm sure you guys know each other, in Toronto, where she worked as a mental health worker in the areas of community mental health and justice and social housing. She holds an undergraduate degree in sociology and a graduate degree in public policy, administration, and law from York University. In addition to her work in diversity, equity, inclusion, and community mental health, she founded Redeem Fitness, Inc., with the hopes of bridging her love of the arts and the history of the Caribbean and African diaspora with her love of community building and best practices for achieving a balance of physical and mental wellness. Please welcome Keishia.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for having me, everybody. I know that the speakers that have gone before me have been amazing and inspirational. Trishana, thank you so much for speaking your truth. That was very powerful. And Yusuf, thank you for also sharing the story with your brother. That was very powerful as well. And I know the pain and the struggle is real and every day. And to be up here standing is really powerful and a testament to your love for your brother. It's amazing. And thank you, Farjus, for sharing all of the information about CMHA and the stats and microaggressions, which I'm going to also be discussing with you. So the title of my presentation is Of 1,000 Cuts, and it was Indigenous elder Dr. Duke Bird, who coined the expression to say that microaggressions, which Farduis explained to us what those are like death by 1,000 cuts. In the case of mental health case management or social workers, it's noted by the time clients usually come to the attention of social workers or social service agencies, they've achieved 1,000 little cuts, compounded emotional wounds, physical wounds, and psychological wounds. The manifestation of those often bring the client to the attention of social service agencies with many cuts, and often people who are acting out in ways that can be harmful to themselves or to others. So I'm going to go quickly over a little bit more information about myself. And then I'm going to discuss confronting anti-Black racism in the mental health and criminal justice system. And then, of course, promoting equity in mental health. So this is my story. So I speak from my location as a Black woman, attempting to grapple with my personal and professional lived experiences of everyday and institutionalized anti-Black racism in the mental health and social housing systems. I also speak with an understanding of my racial identity, gender identity, and social location, and that my life's pursuits thus far have been an act of resistance and a source of strength and courage against white supremacy. So a little bit more about me. So as Chris noted, I went to York University where I studied race and racism, and that was when I actually always had a passion for conversations around race and trying to understand the roots of oppression and why we have these issues and why we have so many of these problems in the world. So it was interesting being able to study that. But then as soon as I was finished that, I started working at CMHA. And while I was there for quite a while, I was there for about 15 years, I got an opportunity to do a lot of different roles there, namely working in mental health and justice. And in that role, I had the opportunity actually to meet with other women similar to yourself, Trishana. I would go to Vanier, or I would go to Penetanguishene and all the different places to meet with people who were about to be discharged from those facilities and go back to living in the community. And try to help them to get the community supports that are needed. But as Yusuf mentioned, without the family support, we would often see that people just weren't as successful as they could be. So the importance of having good family and having friends and those connections around how important that is. Not long after that, I went and did some work on public policy and research. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to know more about the legislative reasons for why so much of these policies that we have that I see impacting the lives of people, why these things exist. And then I started to work in housing equity. And it was during that time that I really started to see how actually anti-Black racism was really negatively impacting not just the housing circumstances, but the overall health and well-being of a lot of the tenants living in one of North America's largest social housing providers. And then with RFWC Consulting Services, that's my way of being able to kind of find the joy in so much of the things that can bring a lot of sadness and a lot of hardship into people's lives. So just being able to go around and have opportunities to talk about this with you all and with other people. And when people connect with me, trying to find information or resources about where to get services. In particular, as you mentioned, the Black community, there is a struggle with finding the resources, where to go, right? There's a limited amount of resources. So what I tend to find is people know the work that I've done in the mental health system. They'll come to me and they'll approach me and see, well, where can I speak to a counselor that's familiar with my issues as a Black person? Where can I get a psychiatrist that I know I'll be able to feel comfortable to speak with? So people are often coming to me trying to seek resources. So you know, if they're coming to me, I'm not necessarily published or advertised anywhere. This is all word of mouth, that there's definitely a need for it. People need to know where to go to access services. So as mentioned, people with mental health issues or mental illness are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, often charged for crimes connected to their mental illness and incarcerated without adequate psychiatric care, and then released back into the community without treatment or supports to assist in recovery. It's important to be able to have the supports that are necessary in order to begin the process of recovery. And as mentioned, 1 in 5 Canadians, and we're talking not just numbers, mothers, daughters, sons, all in need of the support, and many having to navigate numerous systems all at one time. For example, the child welfare system, the mental health system, criminal justice system, in addition to social housing, in addition to trying to find employment, in addition to income supports. So there's a lot of overlapping systems that are in play that really make it difficult for people to get the services and the supports that they need. So I've created this cycle of oppression, and I'm sure that you've probably seen this in a lot of different ways with a lot of different headings, but in this one I identified that the socioeconomic disadvantages that a lot of people in the Black community experience here in Canada result in that definitely impacts mental wellness overall. So when we're talking about the socioeconomic disadvantages, we're talking about a lack of access to services, isolation. We're also talking about negative media representations of Blackness overall. What does that do to you? What does that do to your psyche? How does that impact your mental health, right? The lack of access to supports, a lower income earning, and experiencing higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of incarceration, and obviously suffering poor health incomes. So we can see where the socioeconomic disadvantages that many people in the Black community are facing are directly impacting their mental health, as racism itself is a chronic stressor. Experiencing discrimination or microaggressions every day, or simply living in fear of experiencing them, can cause enough stress to create health issues. Many health issues, including suicidal thoughts, anxiety, depression, just to name a few. And then we follow up with anti-Black racism. So what is anti-Black racism? So anti-Black racism is a collection of a bunch of things that have happened over like hundreds and hundreds of years, from enslavement to forced migrations, stolen property, destruction of communities, dehumanization, the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, torture, medical experimentation, police brutality, racial profiling, and mass murder, to name a few. So you have to imagine for a moment that with this history, all of this intergenerational trauma that we all carry as a result of socioeconomic disadvantages, anti-Black racism, white supremacy, and institutional racism, the challenge that many families face, particularly those that belong to the Black community, in trying to access services and supports in crisis. So as we all know, majority of the time police act as first responders in the event of a crisis. Now, if you have history of police brutality within your family or within your community, the challenge becomes that much more harder to be able to contact the police. You have to contact the police you're bringing in somebody who you feel could be harmful to your family or to your loved one. So then a lot of people are then going without the supports. They're going without the services. We've got families that are just trying to contend with a lot of problems that their family members are facing and not knowing how to do it. So this, again, feeds in more to the institutional racism, into white supremacy, and then, of course, the overrepresentation that we do see in the criminal justice system. So as most of you know, Black Canadians account for 3% of the general population, yet we make up 10% of the criminal justice system. And of course, we see that Black inmates are overrepresented in segregation, and that while in prison, they're subject to more 15% of all use of force incidents. So these are high stats. These are main challenging issues. When I was doing the work with Legal Aid Ontario and had an opportunity to travel across the province, these were stories that we hear over and over and over again from community members. There are so many people that are incarcerated. There's so many people that are having to face segregation. As a matter of fact, in Queens, for Kingston Pen, a lot of the prisoners there are trying to seek out a lot of legal support from the legal aid clinics to try to say, what are we to do every time we keep getting placed in segregation for the least little infraction? And this is at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. So, and this isn't to take away from the fact that our Indigenous brothers and sisters themselves accounting for nearly 5% of the population, yet making up nearly 25% of those that are incarcerated. These statistics show that institutional racism is very much alive and well and creating havoc in our communities. So, I wanted to just touch on the myth of multiculturalism, and I used the quote by Tazaki Shange, who recently passed away, that multiculturalism isn't about culture, it's about power. Because of the myths that we often tell ourselves about multiculturalism, and thinking that we all have it all understood and completely figured out, you end up kind of not being able to focus on the reality of the matter. And the truth is that when you go into the criminal justice system, or you go into the courts, or you go into the child welfare offices, you see an overwhelming amount, an overrepresentation of Black folks there. And this is as a result of institutional racism. So these are things that we have to discuss and have to be willing to have these honest, difficult conversations in order for us to disrupt these systems and these outcomes that we're experiencing. So in conclusion, I just have a few suggestions that, I think would work well, and I think what the community said would work well in promoting equity in mental health, and that would be the development of programs that address the impact of racism, and specifically anti-Black racism, on mental health and the need for appropriate mental health services. One of the things that I experienced while I was working as a community health worker, an organization which I think was mentioned already, but that I always found a little bit challenging when we would get together in these team meeting conversations about trying to figure out is how we could help our clients to resolve some of the problems that they're facing. On this one day that the conversation came up of Blackness, this is when you were seeing a lot of reports in the media about Black bodies being brutalized and what have you. And the thing that I found most challenging was my colleagues, a lot of them were not even comfortable to say the word Black. So if you can't say the word Black, how are you able to try to address all of the issues that come with anti-Black racism? So it just goes to say how far we have to go in order to get the proper supports for the communities that we're serving, because these communities are being served by workers that aren't necessarily culturally competent, let's say, or comfortable even discussing issues of race and all of the impacts that race plays on people's lives. And then a need to create a system that addresses the needs of Black youth with mental illness before involving the justice system. So with the Stop Now and Plan program, the community consultations that we did, we found that what a lot of people were saying was that there are no services that speak directly for Black youth. There's nothing that, the language is just not there. It's not something that makes people want to reach out for the supports and the services that are necessary. So this is definitely something that would need to be addressed in order to reach equity in mental health issues. And the need to address systemic racism, implicit bias, and cultural safety within the mental health system, criminal justice system, to move toward a more equitable system that provides treatment for those in need instead of punishment. And that's what I would like to leave everybody with. I think it's mainly about starting the conversations. That's why I think having panels like these and events like this really do go a long way in creating the conversations and moving them forward as we try to disrupt some of these systems that eventually cost people their lives, right? It's not just a matter of the statistics that we're seeing. These are actual people, and it's important for us to keep that in the forefront of our minds in any of the work that we're doing, whether we're working in the community or, whether we're working within the criminal justice system or within policy or whatever the case might be. So thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you. See, I told you equity would be a theme, right? It comes up every time, and wouldn't it be great if everybody had equal access to the same supports and care, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, or people that have suffered from a mental illness. So thank you very much, Keishia. I have a question for you, if you'd grab the microphone. Thank you. More and more we hear that students are being affected by mental health issues. Why are rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts increasing among secondary and post-secondary students, and what can we do about this?
Okay, so why are rates increasing? I think for secondary and post-secondary students, the pressure of social media plays a large role in that, things that they see, and ways that they feel that they must be, and how difficult it is to bring up the conversations, right, to family members. And the stigma, as you mentioned, I think the stigma is a huge barrier in allowing students to be able to access the supports that are needed. If you feel like you're going to be mocked or you're going to be criticized by your peers, that's a pretty powerful thing. You know, as adults, we can as older adults, maybe we can understand where you wouldn't want to fall, prey to, peer pressure or what have you, but when you're actually in those situations, you see how challenging it is. I have a child who's 16, and when she comes home and she's sharing stories with me, the things that she's experiencing and seeing in school and the challenges that they face, it's difficult. Even knowing what I might know of and being able to give her the support that I would want to give her, I see where the challenge lies. So I think one solution is to kind of make it so that the conversation is something that's a little bit more accessible to young people, but both the secondary and the post-secondary level, for sure.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.